Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our spring semester 2017 Mind and SuperMind. And we're delighted and honored tonight to have Jim Fadiman speaking with us. And so a couple of things first. My name's Andy Harp. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Lifelong Learning. And I'd like to thank 2 or 3 people for helping out tonight and putting this show together, including Jeanette Chen over here, who's our Director for Psychology. And our wonderful, where's he gone? Our wonderful IT team. He's very shy, okay. And Spencer Sherman, Professor of Psychology, who is my psychology mentor. Okay, so a couple of things first, please. If everybody could do what you have to do with your cell phone, which you could be turn it off or throw it outside or drop it in the river. And then I'd like you to, if anybody would like this is the little card here, it's called Quick Facts, and it's just a little bit of information about Santa Barbara City College, about enrollment and so forth, because everybody's always asking us how many students are there at the college and how many in each campus. These are on the table outside, so please feel free to grab one if you'd like to find out how many people we have at Santa Barbara City College. This is our spring semester class schedule, and we still have another 10 weeks of classes to go for the spring. So if you don't have this, then please grab one from outside on your way out. And on your chairs, we have, this is a list of the remaining psychology and health classes for this spring. There's lots of classes for psychology that have not yet started. And 2 to go. The orange flyer, this is about our next Mind SuperMind, which is Monday, May the 8th, and when Rick Katanis is coming back to speak with us again. And finally, on the weekend of May the 12th through May the 14th, this is the Nonviolent Communication Conference. Last year we had over 250 people for this 3-day event. So this is a wonderful, wonderful conference. So if you'd like to come, then you can sign up anytime online or at the office. So I'd like now to introduce Spencer Sherman, who will introduce Jim Fadiman. Thank you very much.
Hello. It's nice to be in this room again. So, when you consider the history of consciousness evolution in about the past 55 years, you kind of have to consider Jim Fadiman over and over again, because pretty much at every turn, or many turns, Jim has been important. So I thought that I would very briefly tell you a few of the things that he has done to promote the changes that we are beneficiary of and that we are ourselves moving forward. So when Jim was an undergraduate at Harvard, he was close friend and co-worker with a guy named Dr. Richard Alpert, who later became Ram Dass. Okay? When transpersonal psychology was first being constituted, one of the people who was constituting it was Jim Fadiman. Okay? And when the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology was founded by 2 people. Jim was one of those 2 people. The first seminar ever at Esalen Institute was given by Willis Harman and Jim Fadiman. Okay? He is a former president of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. If you read the electric Kool-Aid acid test, you may remember that the book began with some guy sticking 3 I Ching coins in the spine of an I Ching book to give to Ken Kesey, who was incarcerated at that point. The guy who was sticking those coins in was Jim Fadiman, who somehow got mixed up with Kesey and the Merry Pranksters. Okay? But apparently, that's all preamble, because the current work that he's doing on microdosing is getting remarkable attention all over the place. So Jim's work is just beginning. A few things that Jim's written a bunch of fiction and nonfiction. I'll just mention his most recent nonfiction book that I know about, which is The Psychedelic Explorer's Guide, which is a truly excellent book. I highly recommend it. And his latest nonfiction fiction work, a novel, is The Other Side of Hate. H-A-I-G-H-T. His website is jamesfadiman.com, and on that website you can see I just saw some of his exquisite photography, which he does on the side. So with no further ado, it is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. James Fadiman.
We're going to try and cover a lot tonight because when I got this invitation, I thought, well, this is a very special series. It's been going on a long time, and it really has been cutting edge. And I'm working on 2 edges, so I thought I'd give you both. And they're totally different, and when we take a break, we'll change attitudes and we'll change what we're doing. But right now, for 20 years or so, I've been making notes to do a book on something about healthy multiplicity, about the insides of ourselves. And I finally got a co-author, and when I gave him my notes, and then I found the other set, he said to me, "Do you know you have 8 outlines of this book?" So he and I are working together beautifully, and for the first time, I want to share this with you, and this may or may not be useful to you, but here we go. Now, I said personal multiplicity, something about inside yourself, and I want you to think for a moment about yourselves, plural. And you may say to yourself, that's kind of silly, I'm a self, it's obvious. 1 body, well, 2 arms, well, 4 lobes to your heart, well, and so forth and so on. And your brain all full of mess, we know, we won't discuss it. But I'd like to ask you a question about that unity that you might think you have. Have you ever argued with yourself? Who is that other person arguing? Just think about it. Have you ever argued with yourself and changed sides? Have you ever looked at something to eat, like that piece of cheesecake, and part of you says, oh my God, it's a piece of cheesecake. I can eat it. And another part of you says, that's not a good thing for you to eat. And literally, you can watch hands move. So what's going on? What is this internal dissension, discussion, argument, etc.? And have you ever been inebriated? Second half of the evening we'll talk other states, but right now we'll keep an old-fashioned inebriated. And have you ever been different than your usual self? I know the part of you that thought you were cleverer, we know that part wasn't accurate. But have you, there are people who say, he's not a very nice person, but he's a great drunk. Okay? If you ever read Angela's Ashes, the father, who is miserable, is so happy when he's drunk. Just joyful. So what's going on? What is going on in that situation? Well, I'm asking you, and also have you had these moral arguments are quite serious. And have you ever done something and later said, I don't know what got into me? But you really know it was you. So I'm going to ask you to let go, perhaps, of the ways in which you might characterize yourself as a single monolithic self. Because if you do that, the world will make better sense. Especially the way you see other people. And I want to read you a little bit of science. And it's a story which suggests to you there's a lot going on that conventional wisdom and conventional psychology doesn't deal with very well. This is a story about Timmy. Timmy's about 11. And I'm now quoting from the New York Times. When Timmy drinks orange juice, he has no problem. But Timmy is just one of close to a dozen personalities who alternate control over him. And if any of those other personalities drink orange juice, they get a case of hives. The hives will occur even if Timmy drinks orange juice and another personality appears while the juice is still being digested. What's more, if Timmy comes back when the allergic reaction is present, the itching of the hives will cease immediately and the water-filled blisters will begin to subside. Okay? Now, I know when I read that, I thought, I hope this isn't true. Because if it is, I've got to let go of some theories. And one of the things I know is that people hate to let go of theories just because there are facts. And I said I wasn't going to mention the president, and I won't. I didn't think it would come up that fast. So this is a kind of, so I'm like softening you up, okay? You know the cartoon Kathy? This is Kathy and her mother. Mother saying, I'm sorry I sounded off about Harold, Kathy. I was being the nosy, hysterical me. And now, Mom? Oh, now I'm the strangely cheerful me. Ready to hop on stage with no warning are the guilt monster me, the loving me, the smothering me, the stern me, the silly me, the pensive me, and the berserk me. That mom is probably one of the most insightful and self-aware beings I've ever heard of. And what and then I have here in front of me a Thurber cartoon. Imagine the Thurber cartoons, very simple drawings, and the wife is angry and she's saying, which you am I talking to now? And have you ever had those arguments? Yeah, okay. See, I want you to not only think about yourself, but think about the people you know. And there's some premises that here's what we're laying out. This is basically observation, not theory. Normal, healthy people have more than one self. Different selves are different. Different values, different vocabulary, different postures, different voices, and often different amounts and kinds of facts. We know of people where one personality knows a language that others don't, which is pretty extraordinary. We also know, and it's not uncommon, for different personalities to have different eyeglass prescriptions. Okay? Now that's pretty scary, and we're kind of back to Timmy and the orange juice. We don't want to look at that one. Okay? And once you let go of the notion that you're a single self, the world works better and is more understandable. So we think that there's a culturally unexamined view that each one of us is a single unified self. And it's a little bit like before we admitted the world was round, it was culturally assumed the world was flat. Now, there was a terrible lack of evidence. You know, it wasn't hard to go out to the ocean and see the ship vanish and then the top of it vanish and then the sails vanish. You know, it wasn't, I couldn't notice, but the assumption was it was flat, so it wasn't noticed or discussed because it was so assumed. And what we're seeing is that pervasive notion of singularity gets in the way of seeing reality. And that's never a good thing. So what we're seeing, instead of a single unified self, is we're seeing that everyone we know, at least, is inconsistent. And what does that mean? It means that they're not predictable in the way they're going to behave. They may be predictable, which is they're going to behave this way unless they're angry, or unless they're frightened, or unless they're drunk, or unless they're turned on. Okay, but that's a lot of or else's. And what I'm saying to you, and this is again a question, is are you different when you're sober, when you're playful, when you're sexually aroused, when you're drunk, when you're stoned, when you're furious, when you're terrified? Okay? And what happens when you let go of the notion that I am a person, the same person that I am in the morning, I am in the evening, and all day long, the world becomes understandable. Particularly the person you live with who doesn't behave correctly sometimes. You are fine, but that person you live with, and all these years, they've been inconsistent, in spite of all the things you've done to help them. And remember, since you're thinking of yourselves as couples, the other person who's sitting next to you is thinking exactly the same thing about you. Now, if you step back a moment and see what happens when you get rid of a false belief and put in reality, I notice some of you are elderly, but you probably don't remember when the Earth was the center of the universe. But it would last a long time, that belief. And the problem was, for early astronomers, I mean for mathematical astronomers in Europe, it really got difficult in the beginning of the Renaissance. Because the problem was they knew the planets had orbits, because they kept showing up again. How do you lay out the orbit of a planet if you have to have the Earth as the center? Okay, and the answer was, it's really, really hard. But the nice thing about scientists is you give them a wrong premise and they're just off to the races. And so these unbelievably intricate orbits were being created by these poor guys. And then gradually we moved it so the sun was the center, and poof, everything worked. Everything fit. Everything was easy. It's an oval. I can do that. I can do it with just, with a compass, like 2 hits, and I've got it. And astronomy suddenly leaped forward, because it wasn't basically trying to, carry water in a bucket with holes in it. And so the incredible inconsistencies of the prior theory, once they were taken away, everything got very nice. And so what we're looking at is, what are the advantages of the multiplicity? Okay? Now, how many of you know who Herschel Walker is? Herschel Walker? Football player, among many, many other things. He also danced ballet. He also ran and runs, I think, a multi-million-dollar company. And he's got about 4 or 5 other amazing feats in his life. And he'd retired from football and he was doing other things. And then he became aware that he was angry at someone. And here was the dialogue that he had with himself. He is mad at someone and he's driving over to their house. Every few seconds I'd hear a voice telling me, "No, Herschel, it's wrong. You can't shoot a man down in cold blood over this." It was something about an automobile purchase. Over that voice, I'd hear another urging me on. "You got to take care of business. The guy has done you wrong. You can't let him get away with this. Kill him." Over and over, the two voices were shouting with me, each one pleading with me. Now, again, who's me? "Do it." "Stop it." "Do it." "You can't." "Do it." Like the pulsing rhythm of a chorus. Fortunately, Jesus comes in here. Herschel's faith, aided by a Jesus bumper sticker, intervened, and he went into therapy. Okay? And he then wrote a book about it, about his coming to therapy and these multiplicities in his personality. But at one point, when he really began to understand himself, he said, "What made me different? What characterized my distinct form of disassociated personalities? That for the majority of my life, the alternate personalities that I developed did more good than harm. I believe they can be a powerfully effective force for some people. And that might be the greatest shock you're going to encounter in reading this account of my life." Now, one of his, this was a fat kid, by the way, and he decided that he needed to exercise, and he didn't like it, but part of him wanted to do it, and part of him didn't. He then started running, and he had great pain in his knees. And he went to the doctor, and the doctor said, "Stop running." And he thought, "I don't want to stop running." So he learned to develop a self that didn't feel pain. Now, I don't know if any of you played professional football, but that's an interesting thing to be able to develop. Okay? So Herschel, who also says things like, "You don't want me, the football player, to be the person who's babysitting your kids. You want the person who loves children and cares about them, who's also Herschel." So I want you to kind of keep Herschel in mind because he's a fantastic success, and he had things that kind of got out of hand, and he was helped. Well, what we do know is that creative people are much more likely to acknowledge these different selves. And what we know about that is that they know, in a sense, which self to use at which time, so that they can be in doing the best parts of themselves for the right occasion. And the way I think Herschel says it very nicely, you don't want the football player to be your babysitter. You also don't want your babysitter to be playing football. So what we're looking at is what is the distinction? Why are creative people more creative? And one reason is, we think, because they know how to use themselves better. And the psychologist that probably Spencer could pronounce his last name, but his first name is Mihaly. Csikszentmihalyi. I still don't believe I said that. After interviewing creative people about various fields for 30 years, what he observed is, if I had to express in one word what makes their personalities different from others, it's complexity. They show tendencies of thought and action that most people have segregated. They contain contradictory extremes. Instead of being an individual, each one is a multitude. Now, some of you may remember Walt Whitman. Yep. Do I contradict myself? Very well. I contradict myself. I'm large. I contain multitudes. Self-observation. This is not grandiosity. He's not saying I'm a very big person. He's saying I'm a lot of people and so are you. So what we're seeing is that this is a way of looking at yourself. And one of the other ways to look at yourself is to look from a different lens, a slightly pathology lens, which is psychotherapy. And a number of you are therapists, or a number of you have been to therapists. And one of the interesting things is, I recall a long, long time ago, I was doing research on alcoholism cures. And there's 4 or 5 ways that people get over alcoholism. And they have percentage successes. Psychotherapy is the worst. It runs about 2%. Psychotherapists don't like that, but that's the way it is. And I thought at the time we could kind of do a personality test, and there you are, alcoholic, needing help, and then you take a personality test that says, oh, you're going to like AA. You're going to like antabuse, which is a chemical that makes you throw up when you drink. Terrific. Okay? It's not really that popular. There's behavior changes. There's things. And then there's psychotherapy. And what I realized is, why does psychotherapy not work? It isn't that psychotherapy is inherently worthless. Well, having been a therapist, I can testify it's not worthless. I won't go much higher than that. But it's particularly a problem because the alcoholic doesn't go to therapy. See, imagine, if you can imagine, there you are, you've been drunk, and you made it home, and you find that the floor looks just like the bed. So in the morning you're sore. And you feel terrible. You feel sick, you feel hungover, you feel ashamed, you hope that nobody recognizes you from what you did. You also may remember you had a wonderful time. But you feel sick and ashamed because you don't feel like being an alcoholic is a good thing. So you go to therapy. Now, who goes to therapy? Is this person that woke up with a hangover, got no pleasure from drinking at all because they weren't there, and they go to therapy. And they and the therapist talk about the drinking behavior, which is a little bit like saying, you know, I have a neighbor who's really a noisy drunk, I'm going to go to therapy until they stop drinking. And we do that. And since a therapist may have the theory that you're a single self, they think that's fine. Because they were caught in the system of singularity. Now, another cartoonists, you see, kind of notice. That's what their job is. They notice what's a little odd about human beings. You may be familiar with Dilbert. If you're not, stay after. I'm going to tell you about a great cartoon. Tina, says Dilbert, why did you call me a flaming blah, 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 blah? She says, I'm so sorry. That was my email personality. My real-time personality is kind and gentle. And he says, oh, okay. And then you see her typing. Never speak to me again, you miserable clump of decaying compost. No, there's actually it is all capitals. But then again, so is everything in Dilbert, so that isn't too helpful. Oh, I remember reading Scott Adams talking about Dilbert and why he draws certain things. It's because he can't draw them any better than that. That it is not voluntary. It's just he doesn't have much skill. So what I'm suggesting is a better way of looking at yourself is, first of all, you're not consistent because that's the way you're designed. And asking for you to be consistent is a kind of nonsense. Okay? You're not going to grow out of it. Okay? Most of you have finally learned that. Years ago, there was a wonderful column about marriage, and it says if you've nagged your husband or wife for 25 years and they haven't changed, stop. It's not working. Okay? You know, which is kind of saying to your spouse, why don't you get taller? Nag, nag, nag. It just isn't going to work. Okay? So on the inside, it's the same. Well, the definition that we're now working on that seems to make sense for people is what you want to be is in the right self at the right time. Or the right mind at the right time, because that's kind of a little more musical as a phrase. And what does it mean to be in the right mind at the right time? Well, what it means is to be able to shift into the appropriate mind. Okay? And we know, we have the kind of cliche from films of someone who doesn't make that shift, which is, it used to be before films were profound and interesting and our villains were complex, is you knew the villain because they would come home and kick the dog. Now, for those of you that have dogs and also have had bad days, you probably don't do that because you shift. And dogs are really good at shifting you, right? Your dog says, I think you're smart. I think you're amazing. You can open doors. I've been waiting all day. Do the thing. Wow. Okay? Dogs are like, and you think, well, okay, hello, dog. I'm back. Oh, yes, and I was fired today, dog. The dog says, I don't care. You didn't deserve it. So there are ways we have of shifting, and they're very old-fashioned, okay? I mean, does anyone ever been told by a relative or a friend, when you're angry, count to 10? Now, what are you doing when you count to 10? I mean, you're not checking, do you still know how to count? Some of you, maybe, won't press it. 8's always tricky, because it looks like infinity twisted on its side. But what you're doing is making a shift. Now, if your relative who told you that was really clever, they'd say, do it with each breath, because then you've slipped into mindfulness. Sneakily slipped in 10 breaths, where you're looking at your breath, and by the time you get to 10, the shift will probably have occurred because you don't want to kick your dog or your wife or your kids, etc. So we know ways of shifting. And we know that napping, sleeping, right? Have you ever gone to bed angry and woken up not angry? Of course. A shift in blood sugar, right? Have you ever been to Starbucks? Watch people doing mood changers? Okay, now I feel better, let's go. Music, singing, chanting, dancing. There's a lot of ways. And what's important is to begin to notice for yourself what works. I'm working with a little bit now and then with a young couple, and they're really lovely when they're lovely, and if either one of them loses it, the other instantly loses it. And sometimes I get a call that says, oh, no, about the other person. It can be either of them. And I think, I'm so disinterested in that, but I will not say that. I say, well, take a walk. And they say, it's snowing. I say, take a walk. I say, okay. And then they come back and clean it up and get on with their lives. And then I get this next call about, oh, he's so sweet, so loving. I don't know what happened. I don't. Because they have some really very disturbed people among themselves. And it's too bad, and I don't know if they'll work it out or not. But what we learn is, and the other is, there's a famous book about getting over horrible events called Candide. And they have a theory that this is the best of all possible worlds, and then it isn't for about 95 pages. And finally, Candide says, let's tend to our garden. And he does that not out of any intelligence, but because he meets someone who has a lovely garden. And when asked about, do you know what's been happening lately and some horrible thing locally, the guy says, no, I don't look at, I don't look at Facebook. That's written in the 16th century, so he really didn't look at Facebook. I don't look at my phone. I don't read the news. I tend to my garden. And gardening is an amazing shifter. Even if you go out there and beat the weeds to death, you feel better. Because in some sense, you're also connecting to the universe again. And the universe says, it's okay. I'm a redwood tree. I've been burned 3 times with lightning. You think you got trouble. And I'm doing fine. I just cover it over. It takes 80, 90 years, but don't worry about it. So we have this capacity to make our lives work. And it's more or less to take as an internal truth that you are multiples and you can change. And sometimes you can't. And that's when you take a walk. Meaning, if you're stuck, you can also acknowledge you're stuck. And that turns out to be difficult, because in a stuck place, you say, it's me. No, I'm not upset at you. It's that you do this thing. I did it last week and it didn't bother you at all. Don't you interrupt me. Okay? I'm sorry if I represent some of you too closely. But we have this. And there's a question of why we have in our culture this incredible notion that this isn't true. And just let me give you one more example from popular culture, because it's way pervasive in popular culture. You remember Fiddler on the Roof? Tevye has these daughters, and 4 daughters, which is already in his situation a tough thing to do. And each of the 3, they get married one by one. And the first 3, each of them wants to marry in a way that's wrong. And he has a song. On the one hand, but on the other hand. And we hear him play out 2 parts. On the one hand, this is a terrible thing and she will never last and it will make me ashamed forever. But on the other hand, she loves him. And for 3 daughters, he gives in. And the 4th daughter, he starts the song and he says, there is no other hand. And he forbids her and it all goes crazy and so forth. But what he's doing is just representing the way we are. Okay? So all I'm saying is being the way we are makes life easier. And it makes life easier in a very amazing way, which is being with other people. Which is, you know someone and you are engaged in something, you buy something from them or something, and they cheat you. And you've known them 10 years. And they cheat you. And you say, you cheated me. They say, I did not. And you think, if you're not paying close attention, you are a cheater and I'm not going to talk to you again. And life goes on and 10 or 20 years go by and, you do that. Does anyone here have a relative that they don't talk to? Anyone? How if I do it by fingers, how many relatives? Okay, and why don't you talk to them? Because 18 years ago, at my daughter's christening, and then they threw up. Now, that's if you think they're a unified self, which means they go around entirely behaving that way all the time during the 18 years you haven't talked to them. The other possibility is one of their selves really misbehaved. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've been to enough weddings where there's a discussion among the bridal party is, will Uncle Louis get drunk and embarrass me? Will Aunt Sadie fall asleep and snore? Will those children, we won't complete that. So we all know about these situations in advance. But if we consider the person as consistent, we're going to reject them. If we consider the person as normal and human and multiple, we're going to not like that part. And we're going to do our damnedest to make it work. We're going to either help them shift, we'll ignore them, we'll, whatever it takes. But we're not going to need to reject them. And then when we turn that around and realize that people could treat us that way, and that people would treat us better if they knew we had some terrible parts, which we know about, which we don't like to mention, then everybody wins. So you're no longer demanding of people what isn't likely to ever occur. So one of the things that happens is you stop being disappointed. Now, I've mentioned spouses. Anybody here notice their children? Such a nice girl. How could she? She is going with such a jerk. How could she love him? When he's with us, he's always a jerk. Possibility. You bring out his jerkness. And they go home each time they're with you, and she says, how could you be such a jerk with my parents? He says, I don't know. They get me. So when you begin to make the shift, life improves. And the nice thing is life improves and you don't have to do anything. All you're doing is observing more accurately. And you're making the distinction. Now some people, and it's possible, have only one personality. Possible. It's a great pathology. Okay, so I'm reversing the usual. Why do I say it's a great pathology? Because we have a name for them. They're called fanatics. And you may know one. How are you? Have you seen what's happening in Syria? And you say, yeah. And I was wondering if you wanted to go to Whole Foods because they're having a sale on salmon. You think the Syrians are getting any salmon? And you think, there is no topic that I can bring up without their one note sounding. And that's a pathology. The single self is the pathology. And I don't know if it exists. It's rare if it does, and it's pretty scary. And you notice I picked something where the pathology wasn't bad. It was kind of a good, virtuous, kind, caring about, but it was still an inability to shift, to be in the right mind at the right time. And that's where we find ourselves. Now, given the reality, and given that people have been on the planet a long time, why do we have this notion that we're a single self? Where did that ever come from? Well, a couple of possibilities. Monotheism is one of the possibilities. Monotheism suggests that whatever divinity is, there's only one. Now, as you know, monotheism has an initial immediate problem, which is what about evil? And monotheism sneaks somebody else in. It says, well, there's only one God, and the devil is kind of separate, kind of. And then don't push me. Because strict monotheism, and there are lots of them, shove evil right in there with good, and then usually they say, you think it's evil, you think it's good. What do you know, huh? Anybody ever read the book of Job? Job is picked because he's really terrific. And the devil says, he's only terrific because he's happy and prosperous and rich and has nice kids. Why don't we kick the shit out of him and see how he does then, huh? And God says, what a splendid idea. It's quite a book. And at one point, after a whole lot of things happen, Job says to God, why are you doing this to me? Does God cop to it and say, well, the devil and I made a bet, and He says, don't ask questions. Where were you when I created the heavens and the earth? God, Job says, I don't know. I'm sorry I brought the whole thing up. Give me boils, fine. I'm just fine. But we have this kind of monotheism. We have the notion of a single God. Now we have lots of other religions where they don't think of that at all. World works fine. Okay? We also have psychology. Remember I mentioned psychotherapy back there? We have the curious thing where prior to early 1900s, there was a theory out in the mental health world called disassociation. The notion is that your parts are associated. Think of the wires in a big cable, all those different colored wires, and they all are kind of together. But if you disassociate, some of the wires pull apart and they may disconnect. And so disassociation was a separation of parts, and those different parts had different capacities, and it's pretty much what I've been saying. And one of the people who studied under the man Schott, who had this theory, was a man named Sigmund Freud. Also a man named Carl Jung, and a lot of other interesting people, Henry James. And this was a lovely time for those of us who were looking at reality. And then Freud had a change of heart. He had a change of heart because he had a theory that the people he was seeing in therapy, who were younger people, had been sexually abused by their parents. And he, for reasons we do not know, changed that theory. Now, one theory, very unkind, says a lot of these people were the children of his friends. Hi, Freud. Welcome to a cocktail party. How's my daughter doing? You monster. Okay? That's possible. But in any case, Freud totally reverses, says the seduction theory is not true, that everybody makes it up, imagines it, because they really want to have sex with their parents, and complicated. And disassociation, therefore, goes out the window. And the people who are still doing disassociation write in their little tiny bits that were left, we're being shoved out. We're being destroyed. This whole theory is being shoved under because the Freudian notion is taking over. And so literally, Freud did not suppress the seduction theory, but he suppressed disassociation. And we had generations of psychologists, of which I'm one, and Spencer still might have been one, where we assumed the monolithic self. And who did we look for wisdom but Freud and the Freudians and the counter-Freudians and the anti-Freudians and the nouveau Freudians, all of whom either you were in psychology, you either were for Freud or you were against him, but you couldn't ignore him. It's kind of like arguing theology and not noticing Christianity. So that occurred, and we were stuck with it. And way out on the margins, it turned out that people like Timmy kept happening. And so then the theory was that there was disassociation, but it took amazing psychopathology to bring it about. You had to have major trauma. And we now have a lot of people who do that, who have that theory, which is in the psychotherapy world, which is, sure, but don't worry, with a little bit of effort, we can take all those parts and we can mush them together. And we can actually have some of the parts willing to die to support the personality. Now, personally, I'm not going to be the part that wants to die. I've got a few parts I'm willing to sacrifice. But they have said the same thing. So there's some very unusual ideas out there, and we will get to it, that I'd like you to think about. And I think we probably better look at a place where we can stop at this. And by the way, I gave you some of those examples from English. Beside myself, don't know what got into me, We looked at French, it's full of it. Je suis hors de moi, I am out of my, I am besides myself in anger. Ce n'est pas moi, it's not like me in Spanish. But those are the same languages. But we also have it in Russian. Wonderful phrase in Russian means to leave oneself, which means to lose control. Another Russian is to bring someone outside of himself, to aggravate someone till they lose it. See, the Russians think of us as, well, other people, not just ourselves. And Japanese, which I figure is a pretty good check, there's a wonderful term meaning to lose yourself, means what happens when you're overcome by rage and do something bad. Afterwards, they might say, I lost myself. Okay, beautiful. So I'm going to skip some lovely, fascinating stuff. See, the problem for me is, and tell you the truth, I'm writing a book with a friend on this. I could easily do 10 hours. But they don't want to have 10 hours. That's okay, they'll like it. Okay. So I want to give you just a lovely quote, or two. One, which is, if you learn to know and understand and deal with the personalities that make up ourselves, it can help us function to our fullest capacity in every endeavor. That's really what we're talking about, which is how can you be more functional, more satisfied, more fulfilled, without making any improvements in yourself. I don't know if, I've learned that if you go to someone's bookshelf, you know a lot about them. And nobody, for instance, owns one cookbook, unless it's maybe Jimmy Beard. But then he got really fat, and then we didn't know what to do with it. But if you have a self-help book, I guarantee you have more than one. So here is a method where all you have to do is pay attention to who you really are, who other people really are, and your life improves. There are ways to do much more work, but that's a huge amount. And why don't we just stop it there and take a few questions. Then we're going to take a shorter break than those of you who are old habitués of this are used to. And then we're going to return and talk about something probably very different. But we'll see. So a couple of questions if we have. You had a question in the back. Did you still want to do that or you give up on that? Okay, yes, please. And stand up and pretend that you are talking to 120 people so I can hear you, because my hearing is not ideal.
Okay. When you're saying you, it's hard to say, are you talking about the personalities or is there some puppet master behind the personalities?
Yeah, see your voice dropped halfway through. Now also, look,
puppet master.
Right.
That is controlling these and
Sure. Okay, yeah, is there a conductor to the symphony? The answer is maybe. But I know symphonies can play, usually when a conductor dies, they have a concert without the conductor, and the symphony plays itself. So the answer is it depends how your internal situation is set up. There's a lot of feeling that if you have the conductor of the symphony, a super self, there's a higher self, I'm giving you various theories, the unifying self, your God self, your higher self. So this is all ways of getting around the problem. Okay, it's a way of saying secretly there's one self. It just kind of looks like a bunch of scatter below that. And the answer is, from our observations, that doesn't hold up. That's all. We like it too sometimes. But my co-author and I are very clear that as we've been writing this book, our relationships with other people have improved. Because we're forever we're much more sensitive now to notice when my co-author says, I know that if I say one sentence to my wife, which is totally true, the rest of the evening is going to be spoiled. Because she's going to turn into, and I'm going to turn into, and then sometimes he writes me, and I said it. And sometimes he writes me, I didn't say it. And we're watching how much the shift is as we were both working on ourselves, seeing this more clearly. And it's such a relief. Because it doesn't stop you from really despising a slice of certain individuals. But it does prevent you from overgeneralizing and distorting your view. Because really, if you're going to be mad at someone and you want to do it as effectively as possible, and as surgically as possible, and as directly as possible, and as accurately as possible. So that's a lot more than your question, but that's the way it goes.
Really, because it still seems like you're saying there's a you in there.
It seems like it.
Kind of,
Yeah. But I notice, the part when I'm drunk and so fucking clever. Other people at the table shouldn't talk at all. And my wife goes, and I say, and later I apologize. Usually just to her, not to everyone else. Okay, so what I'm saying is the one who is on stage, so to speak, in the spotlight, in control, has the feeling that it's the conductor. Because it's running the body, it's running the conversation, it's doing the interpretation, and it makes sense. So I'm not saying that this is incorrect, but that our experience seems to not support that, and with some people I'm sure it's true. But remember, this is not, the generalization is that human beings are multiples. We're not saying how it's set up. And one of the setups is the one you've mentioned. It may be, like personality types, there's a certain percentage of people for whom that's true. Another question, please. Yes, please, in the back, and this is going to be, I have a mic and you don't, so let's see if we can do it.
Okay, can everyone hear it? Yeah. All right. There's in the spiritual realm, there's a term called, I can't even think of it right now, sorry. But anyway, it means being able to live peacefully in the world.
Right?
Is that maybe what you arrive at when you realize you have several personalities in you?
Okay, can you live more peacefully in the world? The answer seems to be your world becomes more peaceful. It's more functional. It's kind of like when you go out to the garage to repair something and you have a hammer.
What if you need a saw?
But if you only have a hammer, you're going to bang on everything. But most of us, when we go out in the garage, there's the needle nose pliers, there's another pliers, there's a hammer, there's a couple of screwdrivers, and then if you're, one of these boys that loves tool shops, you've got all that shit. You've got, the routers and the whole thing. But what you want is the right tool for the right job. Because then it's really easy. If you have just the right screwdriver, and there's 3 or 4, and you got the right ones, it's a snap. You don't have the right screwdriver, you get very angry sometimes at inanimate objects that have done nothing to harm you. The same thing about your personality. Okay? Now, one of the things I've been learning is people who write creatively for a living, most of them write 3 or 4 hours a day, including really very famous people who've written an enormous amount of stuff, including scientists like Darwin. And what they've learned is that's about it. The creative self has about 3 or 4 hours. Now, we'll change that when we talk in the next hour, but without supplements. And that is the way it is, and then they do other things. Now, what's going on? Well, what they're going on is that self says, I'm tired, that's all I can do. And you say, well, but unconsciously, are you still working on the writing? And the answer is, the part of you that is out, say, being sociable is not working on the writing. The part of you that you are not in touch with might be working on the writing. How many of you have ever woken up with the answer of a problem? Did you ever notice who was working on it? Wasn't you because you were asleep. And then if you go into the psychology books, it gets really mushy in there. Your unconscious did it. What does that mean? You're unconscious. Well, remember, there's a theory. There's another theory which is worse than the conductor notion, which you have no self at all. And I'll give you two examples, because I love it that it's these two people. It's Buddha and Skinner. Classical Buddhism says your personality is an illusion. What you are is a mass of attitudes, beliefs, notions, intentions, emotions, and that if you take those all away, there's nothing there. It's the same notion of noticing. It's a very famous dialogue between a king and a sage. And the king says, I've come to talk to you about this Buddhist concept of no self, and who is greeting me but a person? Ha! And the sage says, oh, hi, king. How'd you get here? In my chariot. Really? What's a chariot? And the king thinks, I'm being put on. You know what a chariot is. He says, is a chariot the axle? The king says, no. Is it the wheels? No. Is it the floorboards? No. Is it the front part? No. Is it the reins? No. Is it the horses? No. Oh, king, I don't know what a chariot is. If it's none of, you said it's none of those things. The king says it's all those things. I mean, you call all of those things piled up together a chariot, but that's just a name. And hello, king, people call me Arjuna. It's just a name. I don't exist. That's Buddhism. B.F. Skinner says there's only behavior. There's nothing in the black box. And you say, but what about the unconscious? He says, I have a term for that. It's called an explanatory fiction. He says, for example, Jupiter sends down lightning bolts. And your unconscious made you do it. He says, explanatory fictions. He says, with Zeus, we have a better, so, we now know more. We don't think Zeus did it. But psychologists, other than Skinner and his friends, they still have this kind of mushy stuff in the invisible dark when they can't possibly be anything there because there's just behavior. So it's, the no self is out there. You can try that if you like. I personally find that when I do that, I don't like it. So I think I'm still here. Okay, so I think in terms of time, we're now going to take a break. Those of us whose bladders have matured, and I hope you know enough about this setup to know where you're going to do that. But let's make the break as short as we can, because we have a whole other area and you're going to have more questions on that, I think, than on this. So thank you very much for this. Let's take a break. How many of you have some experience, small to many, of using psychedelics? Oh, Santa Barbara. How many of you have actually tried microdosing? Oh my God. Why don't those of you who've microdosed talk to everyone else? Okay. Well, we're dealing with a very, I was going to think a new phenomena, but I just talked to somebody wonderful here who indicated he'd been microdosing for 49 years. So, but then again, indigenous people have been microdosing for maybe, 10,000 years. So, but it's new to a lot of us. And what is it? Okay. What is it? It's 1/10 to 1. It's taking a micro dose, meaning a dose, little dose, is 1/10 to 1/20 of what is known on the street as a hit, or as enough to make a serious trip. Oh, it got very quiet. Here's the disappointing part. It has no psychedelic effects. Okay, questions? Meaning, and a microdose is any of the major psychedelics. LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, mushrooms, etc. Okay, so not much differentiation between them. There's a lot of differentiation between them at higher doses. When I say it has no classic psychedelic effects, that means no incredible imagery, no incredible profound insights about who you really are, no being touched by Jesus or whatever religion you happen to believe in, no mystical experience of transcendence where you find that time and space are irrelevant and that you have always been here and will never die. That's higher dose. Different evening. Microdosing is taking a little bit. And the rocks don't glisten even a little. And when you walk by flowers, they don't turn and watch you. Okay? And when you look into the face of your dog, a dog looks back. And says, "Are you on some kind of stuff again?" How did it come back into the Western world? And here you are. Albert Hofmann, who synthesized LSD, microdosed at least, and I don't know much more, but at least the last 2 decades of his life. He died at 102, and at age 100 he was giving 2-hour lectures. So maybe it had some value. And he said it's under-researched. And had Sandoz, his company, bothered to research it, Ritalin would not have had a market. Now, if I'm talking to a college audience, I say Adderall, and they go, because that's it's the second most popular illegal drug at college is Adderall. Marijuana in California, of course, so Adderall just became first by marijuana being moved into legal. One of the people, Hoffman recommended microdosing to a friend of mine who was in a new relationship and wasn't working too well. He told me about it, and I got interested. And the rest is history. And I was thinking of, well, let me, since you're a psychedelically astute crowd, let me just read you what microdosing might be like, and then I'll tell you a little bit more about who's saying this. I took it before 10 a.m. on an empty stomach. After an hour, this is the first time someone microdosed. After an hour, I immediately felt slightly euphoric. I wasn't expecting such a nice feeling. I was very motivated to manage things which I usually don't like so much. For example, cleaning my apartment, smiley face. Paying bills, doing some home office work. Also, I realized that my thoughts were much more positive than usually when it comes to problem solving. Right now, my life isn't very easy, but my inner setting seems surprisingly very optimistic. Okay? Now, she took it again. I was experiencing a very different mind than usually, meaning regularly I feel very depressed, anxious, and worried, but with the microdosing, my mind immediately changed. I felt very optimistic about my life. I start to dose my mood. English is not her first language. I start to dose my mood immediately changed. I felt optimistic. I start to focus on solutions and challenges rather than the problems. And then we'll slip back for a moment to the prior lecture. To me, it is like observing another me. Somehow, I always believed the way we look at things is affecting our life. But now it wasn't anymore just a thought or belief system. Instead, it becomes a certainty to me. Okay? And another quote, this is from a college freshman. sorry, this is from a woman who'd been taking microdoses for a number of years. It allows me to increase my focus, open my heart, and achieve breakthrough results while remaining integrated within my routine. I'd venture to say that my wit, response time, and visual and mental acuity seem greater than normal. Used it about 6 times a month for 10 years. So what's going on? Well, let's look at these two people for a moment. Marilyn is a highly successful woman. She runs a company. She also is a filmmaker. She also has one child, a husband, a lover. They all like each other. And she takes care of both of her parents, who are elderly and ailing in different ways. She says microdosing really helps. But she's a highly successful person. The first person I read, let me just give you all the background I have on her. Struggling with depression, anxiety, eating disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and ADS, I think ADD, for nearly 18 years. So those are 2 different people from 2 different walks of life who are microdosing. That's, to me, very startling, and why I've been pursuing this particular line of research. And one of the questions that I'm often asked by media is, how did it spread so quickly and so widely? And when you've been doing something for 5 years and in the 5th year something happens, it doesn't sound quite as quick. But at first, it was word of mouth, because I was asking people, would you try this and let me know something about it? Because I do what I call search, which is I like to find out stuff. Research is when you have an assumption and you're going to try and prove it. And so with microdosing, what I knew is, what I've told you, is Hoffman took it and nice guy. Well, there were some media reports, and then Rolling Stone did an article. Now, a little teeny article, about 3 paragraphs, and the reporter called me, and I do what I do with reporters now, which I say, do you have any psychedelic experience? And he said, I haven't taken anything for a month. I thought, well, okay. We can, so I'm cooperative. I'm more cooperative with people who know what I'm talking about. And he interviewed one person. And he wrote an article about the one person and that other people seem to be doing this. And the headline said, "New fad in Silicon Valley." Now, for those of you that play the science game, that's called an N of 1. Okay? That's as if he'd found an elephant. And he wrote, there are elephants all over Silicon Valley. Because I found one. Well, what happened from that, some of you remember when journalism had journalists. Now they have copyists. So there are about literally between 10 and 15 articles all over the media about this new fad in Silicon Valley, either quoting Rolling Stone or just stealing it. And what happens then is, gee, it's a fad. I'm in Silicon Valley, and I'm a young professional. I haven't done this yet, but it's a fad. How cool. Yeah, I dropped acid. I went to Burning Man once, but the idea of taking 10 micrograms, it sounds kind of ridiculous. What a waste. And so people started using it. Here's a quote from a lovely article in Wired about a year later. Lily, a publicist for several startups, sits down with a cup of tea and a credit card-sized bag of dried magic mushrooms. 28-year-old breaks up the caps and stems, places them in the herb grinder, blah, 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 blah. Once finished, she pops one of the capsules into her mouth and washes it down. She's now ready to start her working day. It helps me think more creatively and stay focused. I manage my stress with ease, and I'm able to keep my perspective healthy in a way that I was unable to before. Lily is one of many young professionals experimenting with, and so forth. So the fad is caused almost entirely by media for the first round. But most of the people now who I meet who are microdosing, they say either I was told by a friend or I've just told 2 friends. So it's becoming widespread, even in such cultivated enclaves as here, let alone Berlin, London, etc. And the articles keep coming in the funniest places. Now, how many of you, for example, regularly read Marie Claire for your psychedelic news? Or GQ? Or Vanity Fair? Or Fortune? All of them have had articles on microdosing. Some of them have articles about people like the young woman I read about who for 18 years was depressed and crazy. She's, by the way, is on total disability. She's getting paid by the government as when she started this. I just wrote her again today and said, "Are you working yet?" Because her report goes on and it gets better. What then happened was there was one book by a woman named Ayelet Waldman, and she wrote a book called A Pretty Good Day: How Microdosing Made a Mega Difference in My Mood, My Marriage, and My Life. New York Times, the Sunday Magazine of the Times, the Washington Post, the San Francisco Weekly, Italian and Swiss television, and a few weeks ago, the Today Show. Now, on the Today Show, they had Ayelet, and then there was a minute of me. I think microdosing is basically a healthy, kind of straight, I think I had a jacket on. And then the third person was someone from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, who only said, there's a lot of things out there that are sold as LSD, and they're really bad for you. He didn't say LSD was bad. Big breakthrough. I hope in time. So, what's going on? Not only what's going on, but how do you use it? And this will save some of you a little trouble. Which is, curiously, the way people use it is you take it on day 1, and you don't take it on days 2 and 3. And then you take it again. It's called a cycle. And this woman, we reported on cycle 1 and cycle 2. And why? Well, most of you have had psychedelics, and what you know is that psilocybin lasts 5 to 8 hours, and LSD lasts 8 to 12 hours, and if you know about something called ibogaine, it can last up to 36 hours. But you mainly take ibogaine if you're trying to recover from heroin and other serious addictions. And why is microdosing lasting 2 days? Well, because if you actually think about your own psychedelic experiences, after the 6 or 8 hours or 12 hours, for weeks afterwards, you're in a different space. That counts. And those of us who've spent our entire career studying psychedelics absolutely ignored that. We all said 8 to 12 hours, 7 to 9, and so forth. Which is bizarre, but hey, that's us. But when you're not getting any effects, then you're watching the whole situation. And what many people have found is the second day actually worked better for them. They're more functional, more focused, and so forth. Now, why the third day? Well, because I'm doing research and I made up that protocol. The third day is so you come down. And you say, whoa, I'm not as such and such as I was the past 2 days, and then you take it again. And what I ask people to do is do that for a month and write me a report. And so at the moment, we've now expanded that, so now people are not only writing a report in 30 days, but they're also checking in every day with a little mood scale. How's your energy? How's your emotions? How's your sleep? Just a kind of very, very simple scales. Because we have a lot of people with a lot of different conditions, and we're trying to find out what's the difference between, like this young girl who was terribly depressed and Madeline, who was far from being ever depressed. And is there a difference between people who have post-traumatic stress disorder singly and people who have learning disability, or whatever we want to call it? Alternate ways of learning that the school system punishes you for, okay? Well, we are, at the moment, we have, now, I don't know if you know much about psychedelic research, but if there's a study, let's say one I know on smoking cessation, you had to be smoking for 20 years to get into the study, you had to have tried a lot of ways out, and you were like a 2-pack-a-day smoker. And they did 12 people. And they had an 80% success rate of abstinence after 6 months. Now, that's better than any smoking cessation method in the world. And what people say is, wow, or they say, well, that's a very small group, how do you know? And I have smokers in our group, and we have 2. But they're fascinating because one of them, when I asked, he said, oh yeah, and I gave up smoking after microdosing. I said, would you mind writing me a paragraph or 2? He said, well, actually, I kept a journal. Scientist. And his journal basically, he'd only smoked a pack a day for 5 years. So he wouldn't have gotten into the big study. But he microdosed about 3 times, and he stopped being interested in cigarettes. And I said, how long was that? He said, about 8 months. I said, do you have any interest in smoking? He said, of course not. Like, what kind of a silly person would smoke? So what's going on? Well, I keep try and find a name for the way I'm working, and the one I like currently is citizen science. Because that sounds almost patriotic. Citizen science with Schedule I drugs, hey. Now, by the way, just so you don't feel that you're a special group, because so many of you had psychedelics, since LSD was made illegal, and we're just talking LSD, 26 million Americans have had LSD. And most of them, if we looked at the education, probably in the top half of the educated population. Probably 80% of that. So you're not as specialized a group as you might have thought when you all raised your hands. So we're trying to find out what's the full extent of microdosing. And we're trying to use that information to help conventional researchers who are much more limited. Remember I said the smoking was 12, and we have 2? But we happen to have 500 people in our study. And for those of you that play the game, that's so amazing. You know, we're practically at the aspirin heart study. And what we're saying to them is, here's the protocol and let us know what happens. And so what we're learning, and there's 2 big groups. There's the problems group. And by problems, I mean illness, mental illness, chronic, and also usually treatment resistant. Now, this is a very peculiar term. Someone is a treatment resistant depressive. Now, the assumption is it's their fault. It's their fault that my medications didn't help you. Whoa. Okay, but they're called treatment resistant. And they're the ones who obviously write us because they've tried a lot of other things, and people don't start with Schedule I drugs. Some of you, yeah, I know, but I'm not talking about that. And what we're finding is, for example, that people who are treatment-resistant depression, meaning 5 or more drugs, have an amazingly high success rate. As quickly as this young woman. Actually, I don't know how old she is, but I think she's in her early 30s. And that breaks down all kinds of theories about how depression works and how it works in the brain and why antidepressants work and why they don't work. It's cutting at a whole nother way, and we don't know what it is, and what we're doing is setting it up so our neurochemist friends can now say, since I'm pretty sure that if I give it to depressed people they're going to change, I can start to measure the stuff I want to measure. Because conventional research with schedule-run drugs is horribly expensive. A guy in England who did a study actually with depression, he said it costs us about $1,500 per subject for the drug. The cost to us should be $75. But there's a lot of enormous amount of extra work that goes into it, an enormous amount of extra costs in making it, and so forth. And I've been in a couple of talks where they're interested in doing a marijuana post-traumatic stress study, and they're saying, but we can't get the marijuana from the federal government. And in the audience, right, and the other guy says, and the guy who's talking says, I know. And they recently, this is MAPS, M-A-P-S, they recently bought enough MDMA to do a whole series of studies, and it cost them $400,000. Now, probably, if you bought it, it might be $25,000. So small groups are almost a necessity in this kind of work, except for us. And we're running this giant study with all kinds of subdivisions. And let me just give you one that's a kind of puzzling one, because it's also kind of beautiful. Stuttering. Okay? Stuttering is a terribly disabling disease, or what condition, or whatever it is. And there are a couple of stories about high doses where people have cured themselves of stuttering in a single dose. This is not that. This is microdosing. And this is a college student, and he started by sending me audio recordings of his reading a passage, and then he would mark how many stutters there were. And then he would microdose and take it again in a few hours. He's kind of researchy. And then I got him to tell me what was happening with the rest of his day, because the improvements were slight in this kind of very experimental setting. How about the real world? Contrary to the findings from the readings, during conversations with multiple people, now this is a heavy stutterer. This is like 400 words and 40 stutters. During conversation with multiple people, I experienced near perfect fluency while talking the entire rest of the day after taking the microdose. While talking to a friend of mine and his sister later in the day, along with talking with perfect fluency, I felt as though I was in control of the conversation and was making eye contact the entire time I was talking to them. Now, stutterers don't make eye contact. And they never control a conversation because they can't speak spontaneously. Because what happens is the word comes into their head and they've got to check it. Is this one I stutter with? Or do I need to pick an alternative? So the idea of fluency is an enormous shift. Okay? Now, what I love about this particular young man, and I do love about him, is he changed his major. He's now going to do graduate work in speech pathology. His goal is to be able to give microdoses to people who stutter so that this terrible disability can be helped. Okay? That's the fun part. Now, if you go through the classic psychedelic literature, and I have, not a word about stuttering ever. Except for these couple of, as I say, a couple of cases of people on their own, usually teenagers, who did it themselves, but it kind of vanished. So we have many people who improve, who have depression, chronic fatigue, bipolar, post-traumatic stress disorder. Total remission, we're not sure. We haven't run things long enough, and we don't know what happens when people stop. Now, the other thing we have is a lot of people want to get off pharmaceuticals. See, we know about addictive drugs, those terrible, heroin and cocaine and so forth, where you always need more and you eventually become a criminal and so forth. And if you're really silly, you know all the stuff of reefer madness, right? Where you smoke dope and rape people. I'm not the government. But what we're finding is people who want to come off of pharmaceuticals, see, if you read the instructions on your pharmaceuticals, it'll say, don't miss a dose. And if you do miss a dose, go right back on it. The reason is you will have an amazing expansion of whatever symptoms you were trying to suppress if you go off your drug. So you're addicted, but you don't get any pleasure out of it. But if you're a pharmaceutical company, they love you. You fill 3 prescriptions and they know you're with them for life. Which is why, if you notice, they raise the cost 800% for various things. Okay. At the moment, I'm watching very carefully a young man using Adderall. This is Ritalin of today. It's basically amphetamine, speed. He's been on a prescription for 20 years. He's 30. He takes a lot. Just a lot. He takes 2.5 of the biggest ones you can get. And he said, do you think microdosing would help me? I said, yeah. He said, I did go off Adderall once. What happened? He said, it was just so horrible. I said, why'd you go off? He said, I wanted to take ayahuasca. So he's not unhip. It's been now 2 months, and he's down 50%. Which means he's now, or actually more than that, he's down to 1 of the largest you can take. And he's perfectly, and because I've told him, you taper. You go very, 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 very slowly, and you don't have the side effects. And we have a lot of people who've come off antidepressants. That's exciting. A few, stuttering. We have one woman with a skin disorder, and I don't remember the name, and it's one of those, you'd have to know skin disorders to know what I was talking about. But it's an autoimmune disease. And she just wrote us and said, only thing that's ever worked. Now, why is taking a microdose of a psychedelic changing an autoimmune condition? Those of you who happen to be professors in autoimmune diseases, be my guest. Yes, please.
Is everybody taking the same thing? Are they taking sandals, acid?
It's either acid or psilocybin or mescaline or 1P LSD, which is an analog which is identical.
But I mean, you're just taking whatever they have.
Whatever they have.
Themselves,
Yep, whatever they have.
So purity and
Absolutely. Purity, all those things. Just like the 26 million people who took LSD.
Can you get sandals, acid anymore?
I'm not dealing, so I can't really tell you about acid.
I don't mean you. I mean, is it?
Yes. Okay. I'll save a big question. When people, and people do, they write in great desperation. They read one of these articles and they say, "But I have no possible way to get a psychedelic. I live in St. Louis." I would have thought Santa Barbara would be harder, but hey. So I say to them, do you know any college students? Any high school students? And there's something called the dark web, or the dark net. And the dark net is where illegal things are bought and sold. And the purity is highest and best in the dark net. Because the darknet dealers have the equivalent of Yelp. So if a dealer doesn't give you a good, a correct thing, then you write on Yelp, this dealer, shortchanged me, or it was something else, or I got sick. That's terrible when you're in the illegal business. So in a very perverse way, the safest, most honest people I have met in the psychedelic world are darknet dealers. And several of them have written us because they want help in doing a research project with microdoses, because they believe in the power of psychedelics and they want to have some data about microdoses so that if there's any problem, there's some data available. I don't know anything else about them. I only know the code name they use, and they communicate it goes through about 3 levels of security before I see an email. So there's an interesting world out there. Now, let me give you another one. And this is how this research actually gets going, which is I get a note from someone, 23, art historian, English. And she says, I know I owe you a report, meaning she's been doing it for a few weeks, but I thought this might interest you. During the month I was taking it, I had my period, and it was normal. It's never been normal. And I wrote back, not saying, I don't care about the rest of your report. I wrote back and said, what are you taking, how much, the kind of questions you just kind of asked of purity and so forth. And are you doing this every month? She wrote back and she said, actually, I only microdosed that 1 month. But my incredibly painful periods are now normal. You have changed my life. Thank you. We now have about 12 people in that little subgroup, including, I learned, one of the more important psychedelic researchers in the United States. So that's another wonderful bit of research if anyone wants to do research and wants to alleviate an incredible problem for young women. And Motrin just doesn't do it. Because a lot of things that are difficult, the drugs suppress the symptoms so you're bearable, but there's no improvement. Now, does 1 month of microdosing cure PMS? We don't know. I know another girl who says, I only microdose 2 days before my period. See, we don't control all the variables like good science, but like search, we're discovering things so that other people can do good science. And if someone had said to me a few years ago, great research idea, take 1/10 the amount of psychedelics and give it to women with bad menstrual periods, I thought, what a stupid idea. What does that have to do with seeing God in every tree? So the other group are creative people, artists, musicians, graphic designers, computer skills, students, often a mix of the two, and sometimes with learning disabilities, and students just wanting to do better. And we have a report from someone from an Ivy League college who said, I'm a perfectly good student, but I decided to take the hardest math course available to undergraduates. And then I started microdosing 2 weeks into the course, and the course was a breeze. And then I wrote him and I said, hello. And he said, a lot of my friends are taking it about other courses. And that was the last. Then I never managed to get the other people. But it suggested that there's some very interesting possibilities in the academic world for improving things. And I'm just looking for a little pile of academic and not having it, but I'm looking now at the general question of what happens what does fully functioning mean? What does better functioning mean? Here's a quote. I've been observing and taking notes of the changes in mood, creativity, and cognition. In microdosing, I find I am more engaged than ever in my schoolwork. My motivation has skyrocketed, and I feel a greater sense of purpose and direction in doing seemingly meaningless tasks. I no longer feel lethargic and tired in my classes, and I'm able to retain my professor's speeches better than ever before. It's as though I can replay previous statements and write them in their entirety while simultaneously retaining the words they're currently speaking. If that makes any sense. Now, having been a professor, that's terrific. That's what you're trying to do, because we all know you write slower than you hear and slower than your professor speaks. I can look at a PowerPoint slide once or twice and remember it in its entirety without needing to glance back and forth between my notes and the slide. Someone else. My first semester in college was a breeze thanks to microdosing. I did great on my finals, and I'm ecstatic to continue my subjects next semester. Now, I mention these academic ones because we're in an academic institution. And it may be useful. So, where are we with this? Well, conclusion. Microdosing favorably affects a lot of stuff. Stuff is a technical term used by people like me. And what don't we know? We don't know lots and lots and lots. We don't know the variables for any of these. We also are learning who shouldn't. Because if this sounds too good to be true, it feels that way to me, and I've been doing this for some years. What we do know is we have some data on long-term users. One of the questions is, what are the long-term effects of taking it over a long term? Well, the person I read, Marilyn, early on, who enjoys her wit and so forth, she says, over the 10 years, she's just been more effective. She said, the only time I didn't microdose was when I was pregnant. And she said, I missed it. She said, not that much. Because I just felt I was less creative and a little less focused and so forth. Of course, being pregnant may do that too. Tentative theory, it might restore the equilibrium of the system. Because, you know, what have you got, 1,000, 10,000 little systems in there? And if you think of PMS, why do some women have a normal period and some people have a painful period and some people have just an emotionally upsetting period? And the answer is hormone levels are changing. And there's the best way they can do it, and there's kind of off ways they can do it. And it looks like microdosing rebalances the equilibrium of the system. Now, we have another set of people, migraines. And it looks like microdoses help stop migraines. Now, migraines, and I think this is still old school, I think this isn't true anymore, but it used to be, we knew it was about the changing of blood pressure coming in and out of the skull, which would fit my theory of equilibrium much better than I think the new data. But the new data, I don't happen to know about migraines. But they happen, and the medications make you stand it. Microdosing makes migraines go away. And I have a letter from a wonderful woman. Husband is a holistic physician, which means they've tried everything. And she said, I had a migraine last month. It lasted 36 hours. And I wrote back and I said, I'm very sorry. She said, oh, no. I used to have 23 to 24 a month. So she had one in a month. You want to do some research? See, our goal is to give you shooting fish in a barrel research. What happens for many people, and since they didn't intend this, this is for in the research game, that's really cool. They have, over a period of a month, endless people report my eating habits have improved. My sleeping habits have improved. I'm having less or no caffeine, pot, alcohol. I'm doing that much less, or not at all. And I'm doing meditation or exercise, either again or for the first time. A number of students in college sports report improvement in their sports, such as making the team and things that can be measured. And what's lovely is we're not asking about that. That's the fun about search. So what we're getting is people are making themselves healthier without effort. Any of you ever tried to lose weight? And have any of you ever just lost weight? There's a real difference. Okay? So imagine something that says, it'll improve your health habits whether you like it or not. Now, who shouldn't take it? In a sense, we're trying to find some of those because this is so exciting. People with high anxiety, people with depression and anxiety, they do great. People with just anxiety, we're very mixed because some people say, I took it and I got even more anxious. Meaning I was so much more sensitive to myself that I got more anxious. And some people say my anxiety diminished. So we don't know what's going on, and we need to know who those people were and what other, what the other variables were. And we found people who have had prior bad experiences, physical bad experiences with higher doses. People who've had what we call bad trips, new term, challenging trips. There's a reason. The reason is that if you ask people to describe their worst trip, and this was a worldwide questionnaire, got about, I don't know, at least 1,000 responses about worst trips. And then the question was, how valuable was your worst trip? And it turned out that the amount of people who felt it was among their most valuable trips were as high as the percentage of people who had good experiences, writing another questionnaire, who felt their good experience, their best experience, was important. So the word challenging is a more useful term. And also, people who have challenging trips usually continue to trip. But if people have had a bad physical experience for any reason, we suggest don't do microdosing. And we've had people who write us and say, I had a bad initial experience with microdosing. What should I do? And they give a set of physical conditions. And there was one that I had which was really wonderfully depressing. Temperature flushes, stomach upset, headaches, anxiety. He said, what should I do? I wrote back, stop. Science. And he wrote back, I don't want to. And I wrote back, stop. And he wrote back, I thought about what you said. And I take full responsibility. I mean, So I cut the dose down, it was okay. So he went from 10 to like 6. I don't know that was, that wasn't a good or bad decision. So what we're doing is discovering a whole nother range of, psychedelics are peculiar in terms of substances in the body. If you think of most substances, think of aspirin or alcohol or most things. If you have more of them, you get more of the same effect. Right? I mean, sometimes you have a headache and you take an aspirin. And you still have some of a headache, so you take another aspirin, you have a little more relief. And you can take a certain amount of aspirins and then the side effects overwhelm you and something bad happens. And again, when you're taking a psychiatric medication, there's all this playing around with dosage. Because they know that it's the same stuff all the way up and down. Psychedelics actually are different. They have different, they're like a little radio with different programs. It's all radio. But super high dose we know is transcendental, medium dose is psychotherapeutic, low dose is creative problem solving, lower dose is what we in my era called a museum dose, it's now called a concert dose. And microdosing, which is a totally different world. So that's fascinating. And I wanted to share that with you. We're running a whole bunch of studies, and we're helping a whole lot of people who want to run their own studies. We have 2 different people doing EKG studies because they're EKG experts. And they say, will we find any differences in brainwave patterns post and so forth, pre and post microdosing? The answer is, I don't know, it's a little teeny bit of substance. So I'll let you know in a year or 2. So what we found is safe, help treatment resistant, and illegal in most countries. Not all. There are a few civilized countries. We're not one of them. And as one of my lovely people said, college is going great, and microdosing has allowed me to become more deeply aware of myself and my goals in life. So, we have a little bit of time for questions. Let's have them. Yes, yes, please, and then we'll do one of these over here. Yes, please. And remember, loud. Oh, rule of thumb, particularly with psychedelics, a question is one sentence long, and at the end it goes up. And it never begins with, I got to tell you about my trip first. Okay, so no essays, no declamations, no statements. Has to be a genuine question. You still in there?
I'm still here. So my question is around dosage.
Please.
So my question is around dosage. You talk about, a specific dose of
Sure.
10th, and if it's
Okay.
100 micrograms, and if somebody has a resistance, can it be
Yeah.
first reduced it?
Well, here's what we say.
Yeah.
If you're using LSD, let's use LSD, 10 micrograms is a reasonable dose for most people. Now, I'd say if I take 100 people, 2 of them will say, that was a little too much, I went down to 5 or 6. Out of 200, I'll have 1 that said I went up to 15. Because these are, you see, the thing is when you do search, you're saying to people, what's the right dose for you? And how can we in California know what you in Venezuela, in your rock band, what's the correct dose for you? And the answer is, the correct dose is when it's when you don't see any psychedelic, if there's no perceptual, visual changes. That's the right dose, and you feel better. With psilocybin, which is usually mushrooms, we say 0.2 grams to 0.5 grams and try and find what's right for you, because different species have different amounts of psilocybin, and if you take 2 mushrooms growing together and they look identical to you, they may have different amounts of psilocybin because it varies in nature. And so we ask people to dose themselves appropriately depending on their own understanding. And our suggestion is, if you're not sure, start lower than that.
So someone that doesn't get an effect, let's say, from 2 full hits of LSD does not have
Oh, if someone says to me, I've taken 2 full hits of LSD, that's like 200 micrograms to 400 micrograms, I would say, well, why would you bother with microdoses?
they have depression.
Yeah, and I'd say also, if you want to try microdosing, let us know, because that's a good question, because I don't know. But that's a little, see, for me, that's like, when someone hits me with a 2x4, I don't notice. So to me, 400 or 200 micrograms of LSD and not noticing, unless this person is what you would call an unbelievable control freak, who cannot this is the person that says, you know why I don't drink? Because I need to be in total control of my consciousness at every possible moment, or else something bad will happen. It's a psychological state of defensiveness. Now, I also know people who've had, say, 400 micrograms, and they're driving in a car and there's a flat. And they have to change the flat. And they can pull themselves out of being God and being the Rockies and change the flat. They don't like doing that, by the way. But people are capable of moving within a state if they have to. But someone who is basically resistant, my feeling is, don't mess with them. Just like the people that say, there are people I know who say, when I drink, it doesn't affect me. And if it's true, I don't want to be near them. That's personal. So does that answer it? Okay. Yeah. And nothing is good for everybody. That's, I think, really important to remember. Particularly when you have someone who's kind of evangelistic, like this guy. That's from the last lecture. You have to be careful of what's correct either for you or for a friend. And so that's why we're saying to people, if you're interested, sign into our research and let us know if there's any questions and let us know if there are problems. So this guy, for instance, had all the bad experiences. We behaved, I think, normally. The other question is, can I take a microdose when I'm pregnant? Our answer is, my colleague is a 29-year-old PhD brilliant woman. I said, what should we take? She said, there's nothing in the literature that says there's any problem whatsoever. Let's say we're not taking any pregnant people into our study, which means we don't want to mess with it, because just because there's nothing that's ever been shown to be a problem, if someone has a pregnancy that has a problem, they're going to try and find something to blame it on. And we just as soon not be on the list. You know, it could be, you know, seeing late movies. I mean, you know, we don't know. So we have restrictions on our research, which is we're not trying to find out everything at once. Now, I did have a wonderful request from someone that said, I'm breastfeeding, can I microdose? Because and not wanting psychedelics into her milk. So we're trying to answer questions based on very little information, and we're doing the best we can. There was a question over here. Yes, please, you with the waggly fingers.
Have you,
Please stand up so that other people can hear you and me.
thank you. Have you done any research on people with memory loss?
Have we done any research on people with memory loss? Probably. Now, I don't say that as an older person, okay? I was just looking at a little histogram of what our age group is, and in the 77 to 87, we only have 3 people. And we have about 20 people in the next, you know, in the 67 to 77, 67 is that group. And no one has written us specifically. Now, they've written us with all kinds of learning disabilities. But if we're talking age-related memory loss, we just don't know. But if the system improves, it would be, my speculation is, one, it would probably do no harm. See, what we've had is people say, I'm in chronic pain, and the chronic pain is, say, from a car accident, and their spine is like horrible or smashed, and they say, will this help? And our answer is, probably not, but you'll feel better. And that's the report we've been getting back, which is, yeah, my pain feels a little less on some days, but I feel better. So with memory loss, which is very, very hard to measure, if someone is feeling, well, I don't feel so bad about the things I'm forgetting, that's all right. Whatever it is I said, yes. Okay, yes, please, and then we're going to go back over here. Yes, please.
Would you contrast this low-dose psychedelics with low-dose edible cannabis?
Well, cannabis is different. Cannabis is so complicated. You know, cannabis has 400 alkaloids. We talk about 2. So edible cannabis, the problem with edible cannabis is it's very hard to dose yourself accurately. Particularly when you say after an hour, nothing's happened, I'll double it. And we know about that. Same thing happens with psychedelics among teenagers, which is this wonderful notion, which is nothing's happening, I'll take twice as much. There's an illogic to that. So the effect is very different. For one thing, we're talking about a 2-day effect. Not true with cannabis, unless you're talking about taking a lot and you have a hangover. The other is we don't see any of these major improvements in things like migraine and PMS. We do see, of course, a lot of pain, you know, a lot of pain, neuropathy and so forth in cannabis. We don't see that in psychedelics. And I think we're really talking very different substances. The main thing they have in common is the cultural, they were illegal, therefore they must be the same. But then, remember, cocaine is Schedule 2. Marijuana is Schedule 1. In case you ever thought there was any scientific reason for any of it. So the answer is, I don't know. But I took a long time to say that. Yes, please.
Demographics of your study?
What are the demographics? that many people 17 to 27, that many people 36 to 47, like that. Yeah, what we're finding is, see, we get more people who have problems than the creatives. The reason is because if you go on a site like Reddit and go to a thread called microdosing, there's 12,000 people on that thread. And various people we've helped have published everything we sent them. So creative people tend to just find out on their own, and people who are trying to be much more careful and also have less psychedelic experience, or are really dealing with so many different multiple conditions that they really want to find out, is this safe? They're more likely to contact us. So our demographic is skewed towards the people who are ill. This is why the Rolling Stone, that demographic, and that 28-year-old did not contact us. The one who takes a mushroom before going to work. So we don't know about her. But we know enough about them, the creatives, so that we can generalize.
Are you finding that any of the baby boomers are getting on the bandwagon in terms of the resurgence of interest?
No.
People that were tripping in the 60s?
Well, at the beginning of the evening, I said how many of you were microdosing. You couldn't see. But you are surrounded by people who tripped. Is this an abnormal crowd? I would have guessed, in total ignorance, that there would have been less of you that were interested in psychedelics and had experience, because I would have fantasied that some of you came to find out about the first half of the evening. I think I was incorrect. I think you are a bunch of heads. And that most of you are, like most psychedelic people of a certain age, and this is not a young crowd, that you are moderately successful in your life, that you're moderately healthy, that you have pretty good relationships, that you probably take a few prescriptions that you wish you hadn't and you're now thinking about microdosing, and that this is not an unusual group who would come to an evening where there's something about it. I did a meetup in San Francisco with a group that was kind of get-ahead entrepreneurs and will do anything. And of that group, and the usual amount of people that showed up at that meetup, and they had really interesting people, was about 40. And I said to my host, there might be more. He said, maybe. So there were 125. And a number of them, they were not dissimilar from this audience, except fewer of them had microdosed, but that was a year ago. I did get a call a few weeks later from a company, startup, that said, we'd love to have you come down and hang out with the staff. We all are interested in your interests. So it's out there, and I keep running into people now who say, I have friends, or I'm at a meeting or something. So microdosing is really, for instance, if some of you were microdosing tonight, none of you would know that, because you would simply be behaving maybe a little better than usual, but not enough to get noticed. Though Ayelet, in her book, at one point, one of her children says, because Ayelet is being cheerful in the morning, and Ayelet is not cheerful in the morning. And one of her children says, hey, Mom, are you on acid? And she says in the book, I hadn't decided to tell them yet. But they grow up in Berkeley, so you can understand where the question comes from. Yes, please.
You spoke about the demographics. In your search, you found with migraines, which you weren't even looking for, or lack of a problem with menstrual cycles. I would think that you might aim at the older demographics, but what you mentioned, memory loss, the dementia.
Well, the question was about, we have a younger demographic, and we might aim at an older demographic. And the answer is, if we were trying to sell something, we would. But we're not trying to sell anything. We're just trying to find out. And I think one of the things you're bringing to my mind is we should perhaps find a way, like give a talk in Santa Barbara, to reach an older demographic. We only respond to people who write to us. By the way, if you want to join the study, microdosingpsychedelics.com. That's one word, microdosingpsychedelics.com. That's our website. You go to the website, it says, hello, welcome to our website. We're studying about this. If you'd like to learn more, then there's some underlined words like self-study form. And then you'll be put into a system which says, what's your age? What are your symptoms? What are you interested in? Do you want to be in the study? Do you want to learn about this? Are you media? Meaning we'll just give you information, so forth. So we're trying to be as helpful as possible, but we're not reaching out because we're not, for instance, the question of dementia and memory loss and so forth, we don't know much, but we didn't know anything about migraines, and we didn't know anything about PMS until, see, all we needed was one or two people to get our attention. So if someone writes us and says, I now remember enough to write you, and that's only after 3 cycles, right, and I already remembered my wife's name, you know, that excites us. I mean, I'm joking only a very little because it's a totally unexplored area. Yes, please. And then maybe we'll have one more question because I feel, I'm sure, yeah, we're way over. Okay. Yeah. Now, the question was, do we include people with brain injuries? The answer is yes. And at this point, I can't tell you how well they're doing. Because at the moment, we have hundreds of people who are in process, and I'll be giving a major presentation at MAPS in April in Oakland with data and PowerPoints, mainly because my co-researcher is doing all that. I won't do it. And I can tell you more. But the people with brain injuries report, as much as I can remember, pretty much some of the same things, which it's better. They're not balancing, you know, they're not becoming acrobats. But we think they're finding improvement because brain injury is a vague term and all kinds of things can go wrong. Because when the brain is injured, the whole brain is affected. It's not the part that gets hit. So we don't know. But it's safe. It's worth trying. And microdosingpsychedelics.com.
Do you love saying that?
Do I what?
Do you love saying the website?
Well, I love saying the website because it means I get much less mail that I have to deal with because I can't stand it when people write me who are in desperate trouble. So I'm trying to get out from under that part of the research, and that's why we have the website. Also, it does a better job of answering almost all your questions. Okay, we're going to have to end this because they throw us out. Okay? So I am very glad to meet you all, and I'm delighted to be here.